Some puzzling new developments tonight in the ongoing search for Nancy Guthrie.
There are some nights that never leave you. Not because of what everyone saw, but because of what nobody saw. The evening of April 14th began like countless others. The neighborhood was quiet. Lights glowed behind curtained windows. Families settled into their routines. Nothing appeared unusual. And yet, somewhere inside one house, a sequence of events was unfolding that would later become the center of a mystery investigators still struggle to fully explain. At the heart of that mystery was Nancy Guthrie. Those who knew Nancy describe her as dependable, organized, and deeply connected to the people she loved. She was a woman of routines, morning coffee at the same time, regular phone calls, familiar habits repeated day after day. She wasn't the kind of person who simply vanished. That fact would become increasingly important as the investigation unfolded. According to family members, Nancy had recently made several personal and financial decisions involving her affairs. By themselves, these changes were not unusual. People update legal documents all the time. But investigators would later become interested in the timing of those changes and in how certain people around Nancy reacted to them. One person in particular would eventually draw significant attention. Tommaso, Nancy's son-in-law, had been part of the family for years. Friends described him as calm, controlled, and deliberate, someone who carefully considered his words before speaking. Nothing about him appeared outwardly alarming. But in the weeks leading up to Nancy's disappearance, some people close to the family noticed subtle changes. He seemed more withdrawn, more focused, different. No one could clearly explain why. Then came the night that changed everything. Later, Nancy's daughter Savannah would recall an unsettling feeling she experienced when she couldn't reach her mother that evening. It wasn't panic. Not yet. It was something harder to define. The feeling that something isn't right. The feeling that a piece of a puzzle has suddenly gone missing, even though you can't immediately identify what it is. Savannah kept trying to contact her mother. No response. As the hours passed, that feeling only grew stronger. Meanwhile, investigators would later discover something extraordinary about Nancy, something that would ultimately provide one of the most important clues in the entire case. Nancy had a pacemaker. Most people think of a pacemaker simply as a medical device that helps regulate heart rhythm. But modern pacemakers do something else. They record data. Every heartbeat, every change in rhythm, every indication of physical stress, every significant cardiac event. Unlike human memory, the device doesn't forget. It doesn't speculate. It simply records. When investigators later analyzed that data, they discovered a timeline that immediately raised troubling questions. At approximately 8:42 p.m., Nancy's pacemaker recorded a significant change. Medical experts reviewing the data reportedly identified signs consistent with severe physical distress. 5 minutes later, another shift appeared in the recordings. Movement patterns became unusual. Not the type of activity normally associated with someone simply walking through their home. Something had changed. Then at approximately 8:52 p.m., the device recorded a major cardiac event. 11 minutes later at 9:03 p.m., the signal stopped entirely. 21 minutes. That was the window. 21 minutes between the first signs of distress and complete silence. And according to investigators, one question immediately stood out above all others. Why wasn't anyone calling for help? If someone experiences a sudden medical emergency, people typically react. They call 911. They contact family members. They seek assistance. But during those critical minutes, investigators found no indication that emergency services had been contacted. No frantic calls. No desperate attempts to summon help. Only silence. And silence, investigators often say, can be just as revealing as words. Later that evening, Savannah managed to speak with Tommaso. What she remembered most was how calm he sounded. According to her account, he reassured her, told her not to worry, suggested everything was fine. But Savannah remained uneasy. She asked additional questions. The answers, she would later say, felt brief and controlled. Nothing that eased her concerns. Nothing that explained her mother's absence. That night she barely slept. By morning, Nancy was gone. Not gone in the sense that she had packed a bag and left voluntarily. Gone in a way that made no sense. Her belongings remained where they had always been. Personal items untouched. Everyday objects left behind exactly as expected. The house still looked occupied. Everything appeared normal. Everything except the fact that Nancy was nowhere to be found. When law enforcement entered the picture, investigators immediately began examining the home. The first thing they noticed wasn't what was present. It was what wasn't. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No damaged doors. No evidence suggesting a stranger had violently entered the property. Whoever had access to the house that night likely didn't need to force their way inside. The second observation was equally unusual. The home appeared remarkably controlled. Nothing obvious screamed crime scene. Yet investigators reported subtle details that caught their attention. A chair that seemed slightly out of place. Minor disturbances that didn't quite fit the otherwise orderly environment. Small inconsistencies that, taken individually, might mean nothing, but together suggested movement, activity, possibly attempts to minimize signs of what had occurred. Then investigators discovered something else. The home security cameras had failed to record events during the critical time period. At first glance, that might sound like a technical malfunction. But according to investigators, the system hadn't simply stopped working. It had reportedly been placed into maintenance mode, a setting that disables recording. And unlike a random power outage, maintenance mode generally requires someone with access to the system. Someone who knew how it worked. Someone who made a deliberate choice. That discovery dramatically changed the direction of the investigation. Because now detectives were no longer asking only what happened to Nancy Guthrie. They were beginning to ask whether someone knew in advance that something was going to happen. And if they did, who? As investigators continued piecing together the timeline, another discovery would push the case into even darker territory. A single word, sent from a phone shortly after Nancy's pacemaker went silent. One word that investigators would spend months trying to understand. The word was handled. And according to investigators, That message would become one of the most unsettling clues in the entire case. Because if something had been handled, what exactly had been handled? And who was waiting to receive that message? Those questions would lead investigators far beyond the family home. And eventually, deep into the desert, the message was sent at 9:11 p.m. One word: handled. Investigators would later study that message over and over again. Not because it was long, not because it contained detailed instructions, but because of what it implied. The timing alone was difficult to ignore. According to the pacemaker data, Nancy's device had stopped transmitting at approximately 9:03 p.m. Just 8 minutes later, someone sent a message that appeared to indicate a task had been completed. Investigators wanted answers. Who received that message? What did it mean? And why was it sent so soon after Nancy's final recorded moments? Those questions launched a digital investigation that quickly expanded far beyond the walls of the family home. Detectives began pulling every available record: phone activity, location data, vehicle tracking information, cell tower connections, digital breadcrumbs that modern devices leave behind without most people ever realizing it. Phones are remarkable witnesses. They never sleep. They constantly communicate with nearby towers. They record movement, routes, stops, distances. And while people can attempt to hide their actions, technology often remembers what they forget. When investigators laid the digital records side by side, a pattern began to emerge. A device connected to someone associated with the home reportedly began moving shortly after 9 p.m. The route wasn't random. It wasn't someone driving around aimlessly. It followed a clear path, away from residential streets, past commercial areas, onto highways, and eventually toward a place that immediately caught investigators' attention: the desert. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand the geography. The desert surrounding that region stretches for miles. Huge sections are isolated, remote, empty, places where a person can drive for long periods without encountering another vehicle. Places where evidence can remain hidden for years, sometimes forever. Experienced investigators know this. And they also know something else. People who choose remote locations usually do so for a reason. The device continued traveling deeper into the desert before stopping at a specific location. It remained there for a measurable period of time. Then it moved again, further away, deeper into the remote landscape, before eventually returning toward the city. 2 stops, 2 locations, both documented, both marked for investigation. Detectives headed to the first site. They didn't know exactly what they would find, but they knew the digital evidence had brought them there for a reason. The area appeared ordinary at first glance. Just another stretch of desert terrain. Dry earth. Sparse vegetation. Nothing that would draw attention from a passing driver. But forensic investigators are trained to notice what others miss. And before long, they began spotting subtle signs that the ground had been disturbed. There were tire impressions, not fresh enough to be obvious from a distance, but visible enough for trained eyes. According to investigators, the tracks suggested a vehicle had backed into the area rather than pulling forward. That detail might sound insignificant, but detectives found it noteworthy. People often reverse into isolated locations when they intend to load or unload something. It's practical, efficient, and deliberate. Nearby, investigators observed additional signs of disturbance. Areas where soil appeared different from the surrounding terrain. Places where the natural pattern of the landscape seemed slightly altered. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to justify a closer examination. Then came the first significant discovery. Investigators reportedly recovered a piece of fabric. The material was consistent with clothing Nancy had been known to wear before her disappearance. It wasn't a complete garment, just a fragment, but it immediately elevated the importance of the location. Because now the desert site was no longer connected merely through digital data. There was physical evidence, something tangible, something investigators could hold in their hands. But that wasn't the discovery that shocked them most. That came next. Buried within the area, investigators reportedly located part of a pacemaker casing, the outer housing of a medical device, one believed to be associated with Nancy. For detectives, the implications were enormous, because this was the same pacemaker that had created the timeline, the same device that recorded distress, movement, and eventual silence. If the recovered component truly belonged to Nancy's pacemaker, investigators faced a troubling possibility. Someone may have deliberately removed it. And if that happened, detectives wanted to know why. Their theory was straightforward. The pacemaker contained evidence, time-stamped data, a permanent record. Perhaps someone believed removing it would eliminate that evidence. If that was the goal, it had failed. The information had already been preserved. But the discovery raised an even larger question. Who would think to remove a pacemaker in the first place? That wasn't the action of someone acting impulsively. That wasn't a split-second decision. It suggested planning, awareness, purpose. Back at the station, investigators intensified their questioning. The evidence was beginning to form a pattern. The timeline, the digital trail, the desert location, the recovered items. Each new discovery seemed to connect to the last. But one mystery continued to grow. The recipient of the handled message. Detectives learned that the number receiving the text wasn't easily traceable. It appeared to be associated with a prepaid device, a so-called burner phone. These phones are often purchased without long-term contracts or identifying information. They're designed for temporary use. And while they're not impossible to trace, they can make investigations significantly more difficult. To detectives, the existence of that phone suggested something important. The possibility that more than one person knew what was happening. If someone was waiting for that message, investigators reasoned, then someone may have been involved before the night even began. A second individual, an unknown participant, someone operating in the shadows. And if that theory was correct, the case had just become much larger. Detectives returned to the digital evidence. The route into the desert. the timing of the stops, the movement of devices. Everything pointed toward a second location, the place where the track device had traveled after leaving the first site. A location even deeper into the remote terrain. Investigators believed that whatever happened at the first stop was only part of the story. The second stop might hold the answers they were still searching for. So they prepared another search. Another trip into the desert. Another attempt to uncover what had been hidden. Because by now, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was no longer simply a missing person investigation. The evidence suggested planning, coordination, and possibly the involvement of multiple people. Somewhere beyond the city lights, beyond the highways, beyond the first desert site where evidence had already been found, another location waited. A place investigators believed could reveal the truth. And what they discovered there would become one of the most controversial chapters in the entire case. The desert keeps secrets. Investigators know that better than anyone. Wide stretches of open land have a way of swallowing evidence. Wind erases tracks, time changes the landscape, and distances that look small on a map can take hours to search on foot. But detectives also know something else. Sometimes the desert doesn't hide everything. Sometimes it leaves clues behind. After processing the first location and recovering evidence that appeared connected to Nancy's disappearance, investigators shifted their attention to the second site, identified through digital tracking data. This location was even more remote. The route leading there eventually left paved roads behind altogether. Investigators followed rough terrain that appeared to have been traveled before, though not frequently. It wasn't the kind of place someone would accidentally discover. If a person ended up there, chances are they intended to be there. When search teams arrived, nothing immediately stood out. The landscape looked ordinary. Dry earth, scattered brush, rock formations baked beneath the sun. Yet experienced investigators don't judge a scene from a distance. They study details. The position of rocks, changes in soil color, disturbances in vegetation, small inconsistencies that reveal human activity where none should exist. And before long, they began noticing signs. Areas where the ground appeared to have been altered. Sections where the soil profile seemed different from surrounding terrain. Evidence suggesting that something may have happened there. Search teams expanded their efforts. They brought in specialists, cadaver dogs, ground search experts, forensic personnel trained to detect what ordinary observers would miss. They worked carefully, methodically, hour after hour. But despite the effort, one thing remained missing. Nancy. The search uncovered indicators that the site deserved further examination. Yet no definitive recovery was made. At least not during those initial efforts. For investigators, that distinction mattered enormously. Because a lack of recovery doesn't necessarily mean a lack of evidence. Remote environments can be extraordinarily difficult to search. Items buried deeply may remain undetected. Weather conditions can complicate recovery. Terrain can interfere with equipment. Experienced investigators understand this reality, which is why they rarely treat an incomplete search as a final answer. The second site remained important. The evidence continued pointing there. and authorities weren't prepared to simply walk away. Meanwhile, back in the city, another crucial part of the investigation was unfolding. The interviews, the questions, the attempts to reconcile witness statements with the growing body of evidence. Investigators reportedly confronted Tommaso with what they had learned: the pacemaker timeline, the digital records, the movement data, the discoveries made in the desert, and perhaps most importantly, the message. That single word, handled. Detectives wanted to understand exactly what it meant. According to reports, explanations evolved over time. Certain details changed. Some timelines became difficult to reconcile with available evidence. Investigators challenged inconsistencies, asked follow-up questions, pressed for clarification. At one point, attention reportedly focused on another word that surfaced during questioning: management. For investigators, the term stood out, not because it proved anything by itself, but because of the context in which it allegedly appeared. The language seemed unusual, clinical, controlled, very different from how people often describe a sudden family emergency. To detectives, every word mattered, because words reveal thought processes. They reveal priorities, and sometimes they reveal intentions. As the investigation continued, prosecutors began evaluating the case from a legal standpoint. Their challenge was substantial. Cases involving missing persons are often among the most difficult to prosecute, especially when critical questions remain unanswered. Defense attorneys frequently focus on uncertainty, on gaps, on possibilities, and prosecutors know they must build their arguments carefully. Every timeline, every record, every recovered piece of evidence must be examined, verified, and connected. In this case, authorities reportedly focused heavily on actions taken after Nancy's disappearance: the security system, the digital communications, the travel route, the evidence recovered in the desert. Each piece formed part of a larger picture investigators believed was emerging. Yet one mystery remained stubbornly unresolved: the second individual, the person connected to the phone that received the handled message. Who were they? What role, if any, did they play? And how much did they know? Investigators spent countless hours following that trail. Burner phones are designed to provide anonymity, but no device is completely invisible. Every phone interacts with towers, networks, signals, records, digital footprints, and detectives worked relentlessly to identify the person behind that number. While much of that work occurred behind the scenes, investigators made it clear that they considered the lead important. Because if someone was waiting for that message, they likely understood its significance. And if they understood its significance, they may have possessed information critical to solving the case. Outside the investigation, another voice continued demanding answers: Savannah, Nancy's daughter. As months passed, she remained determined to keep public attention focused on her mother's disappearance. She gave interviews, spoke publicly, shared memories, and repeatedly reminded people that Nancy was more than a case file, more than evidence, more than headlines. She was a mother, A grandmother, a woman whose absence left a permanent void in the lives of those who loved her. For Savannah, the unanswered questions weren't abstract mysteries. They were personal, painfully personal. Every day without answers meant another day without closure. Another day without knowing exactly what happened. And another day wondering whether someone, somewhere, knew the truth. Today, the case continues to generate attention. Investigators have established a timeline. They've collected digital evidence. They've examined communications. They've searched remote locations. And they've followed leads stretching far beyond the walls of the house where the mystery began. Yet key questions remain. Where is Nancy? What happened during those final recorded minutes? Who received the message sent shortly after the pacemaker fell silent? And what, if anything, remains hidden at the second desert site? Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case is how ordinary everything appeared at the beginning. A quiet evening, a familiar routine, another night that looked exactly like every night before it. Until it wasn't. Until a daughter couldn't reach her mother. Until investigators began uncovering clues. Until a trail led from a family home into the vast emptiness of the desert. And somewhere out there, among all the questions that still remain, lies the answer that investigators, family members, and countless observers continue searching for. Because mysteries can survive for years. But the truth has a way of waiting. Patiently, silently, until someone finally uncovers it. This case is far from over, and will continue following every major development as new information emerges. If you want updates on this case and others like it, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. And tell us in the comments, what detail in this investigation stood out to you the most?